The wind howled over Blackstone Valley, tearing through the pine tops and slamming into the wall of the old house where Ethan Rivers lived. The storm that raged that night reminded him of the toughest moments of his life. It brought not only rain, but also memories. He was sitting by the fireplace, watching the flickering fire, when a sharp sound pierced the night silence. It was a scream, muffled, heart-wrenching, as if suffering itself had burst forth. Ethan abruptly stood up. The chair he had been sitting on creaked loudly, disturbing the cozy atmosphere. The sound outside repeated, but now it was weaker, like a stone. He grabbed a lamp, lit it with trembling hands, and pulled on his old, soaked raincoat before stepping out into the night. A cold gust of wind instantly hit his face, the rain soaking him to the bone. The path to the gate was covered in mud, which his boots stubbornly churned. The light of the lamp barely pierced through the curtain of rain, but it was enough to see a silhouette, broken, almost motionless, leaning against the gate. As Ethan approached, a scene unfolded before him that made his heart ache. It was a horse. She lay as if thrown from the very darkness. Her ribs sharply protruded under the taut skin. Her hind leg was twisted at an odd angle. Her coat, matted with mud and blood, dully gleamed in the lamplight. The horse moved weakly, her faint, strained whinny full of pain and despair. "Oh my God!" Ethan whispered, dropping to his knees. His voice was drowned out by the noise of the rain. The horse tried to move away, her ears twitching nervously, but she had no strength left to resist. "It's okay," he said soothingly, slowly placing the lamp on the ground. "I won't hurt you." Ethan knew he had no time to think. Leaving her here would be a death sentence. He returned home, grabbing an old blanket and a rope. Approaching again, he carefully covered the shivering horse with the blanket, trying to protect her from the cold. "We need to get inside," he said softly, as if talking not to an animal but to a friend. The horse groaned, but did not resist when he gently pulled her by the rope. Each step was a struggle. The mud sucked at Ethan's boots, the rain lashed his face, but he did not stop. When the barn finally appeared before him, his breathing was tense, as if he had just finished a marathon. Inside the barn, it was dark and damp, but still warmer than outside. Ethan carefully laid the horse on a thick layer of straw. Her breathing was raspy, nervous, but she no longer shivered so badly. He quickly examined her wounds. The swollen leg looked terrible, an old fracture, obviously not healed, and now inflamed. The other wounds also required immediate attention. Ethan brought water, carefully wiping the mud and blood from the animal. The horse flinched at his touch, but did not try to resist. It seemed she was too tired to fight anymore. "You've been through hell," he said softly, running his hand through her tangled mane. "But now you're safe." When the storm began to subside, Ethan, exhausted, slumped onto a bale of hay, watching the animal. He didn't know what awaited them, but he was sure he had done everything to save her. Her eyes, heavy and tired, met his gaze for a moment. In them was something more than pain, a faint spark of hope that he could not ignore. The next morning, the storm had subsided, but its traces remained on the land of Blackstone Valley. The rain had left deep puddles and mud, which seemed to have absorbed the weight of the night. With the first rays of the sun, Ethan Rivers entered the barn, where the exhausted horse lay on a straw bed. She looked even weaker than the night before, but her eyes were open, though full of wariness. Ethan slowly approached, crouching next to the animal. He knew that sudden movements could only increase her fear. "Good morning, girl," he said softly, trying to give his voice gentleness. "How are you doing?" Ember, as he had decided to call her, did not move. Her breathing was irregular, but slightly more stable than at night. He noticed that she had barely touched the hay he had left. This worried him. She was too weak to fight, but inside her, there was a struggle caused not only by physical pain, but also by memories of what she had been through. Ethan brought a bucket of water and a small basin of warm water to clean her wounds again. Old scars had turned her body into sinister maps, telling a story of cruelty. Some of them were so deep that they seemed to remain a reminder of what she had endured. Ethan looked closely at her hind leg. The swelling had gone down a bit, but the leg still looked bad. He knew it was not a fresh injury. The prospect of an old fracture left unattended. His thoughts returned to the past when he himself had experienced death. 5 years ago, after an accident, it had left scars in his heart that nothing and no one could heal. Perhaps that was why he could not pass by this horse's suffering. As he carefully began to clean the wounds, Ember flinched, her muscles tensed as if she were preparing for another blow. Ethan stopped, giving her time to get used to his presence. "You're strong," he murmured, continuing his work. "All this time you've been fighting, but now you don't have to do it alone." At that moment, the barn door opened, and Nathan Hazlitt, Ethan's neighbor, appeared on the threshold. His stern face, filled with deep wrinkles, reflected skepticism. Nathan looked at the horse lying on the straw, then turned his gaze to Ethan. "Do you really think she'll survive?" he asked bluntly, crossing his arms over his chest. "I saw her last night. I'm not sure it's worth your efforts." Ethan straightened up, trying to stay calm despite his neighbor's harsh words. "She's been through hell," he replied firmly, "but I believe she can recover." Nathan shook his head, stepping closer. He leaned over Ember, looking doubtfully at her thin body and wounds. "Sometimes it's kinder just to let go," he said, as if apologizing for his words. "No," Ethan interrupted. "She has a chance, and I'm not giving up." Nathan fell silent for a moment, studying his friend's determination. He knew that persuading Ethan was like talking to a wall. Sighing heavily, he straightened up. "Well, good luck to you," he said, leaving the barn. Ethan returned to his work. He continued to treat Ember's wounds, even as the sun rose higher. Each scar on her body seemed to tell him, "Don't stop." He worked in silence, allowing this routine to distract him from doubts and fatigue. When he finished, Ember seemed to relax. She lay quietly, her breathing more even. Ethan ran his hand through her tangled mane, feeling the roughness of her coat under his fingers. "We'll make it," he whispered. "Just give me time." These words applied not only to the horse, but also to his own heart. Ahead lay much to do. Find a way to help her stand, regain her strength, and perhaps restore her trust in the world. Ethan knew the road ahead was long, but he was ready to go the distance. The sun filtered through the tall pines, casting long shadows on the ground. In Blackstone Valley, the morning began slowly, as if nature itself was recovering from the recent storm. In the barn, filled with the faint scent of hay and earth, Ethan Rivers stood by the stall, holding water and a fresh bundle of hay. The horse he had named Ember lay on the straw, her eyes watching him warily, but no longer with the panic fear he had seen the first night. Ethan carefully set the bucket on the ground and crouched beside her. He spoke to her as if she were a person, his voice soft and steady, each word seeming to soothe not only her, but himself as well. "Good morning, girl," he said, smiling. "Today we'll try something new." Ember did not move, but her ears twitched slightly at the sound of his voice. This small gesture showed Ethan that she was listening, and it gave him confidence. He reached out his hand, taking his time, giving her a chance to get used to it. The horse tensed, her nostrils flared, but she did not move away. Ethan knew that each of his movements had to be measured. Haste could ruin everything he had achieved. "You're strong," he continued, as if his words could heal not only her body, but also her soul. "All you need is time, and I'm in no hurry." As he took a cloth and began to carefully wipe her wounds again, the barn door opened. This time it was not Nathan. Owen Clark, the veterinarian, and an old friend of Ethan's appeared on the threshold, holding a small box of medicines. His smile was gentle, but his gaze was concerned. "You, as always, take on the most difficult tasks," he said, approaching. "What do we have here?" "A horse that someone left to die," Ethan replied, not looking up from his work. "But I won't let that happen." Owen crouched down and examined Ember closely. He was a man accustomed to difficulties, but even he could not suppress a heavy sigh as he looked at the animal's condition. "She's in bad shape," he said, unpacking his instruments. "But you're right. There's a chance. She needs ointment for her leg and good care. Everything else depends on her will." Ethan nodded. Together, they began to work. Owen explained how to properly bandage the wounds, how to apply the ointment, and what to feed the horse to help her regain strength. Ember tensed at first, feeling unfamiliar hands, but by the end of the procedure, her breathing had become more even. "You'll manage," Owen said, standing up. "And it looks like she has a reason to fight." "A reason?" Ethan asked, looking up at him. "You," Owen simply replied. "She sees that you're not giving up. That's important." Later, when Owen left, leaving some medicines and brief instructions, Ethan was alone with Ember. He sat on a bale of hay, watching her. The horse lay quietly, her eyes no longer darting around in search of danger. In them, there was a faint but noticeable spark. "See," he said, addressing not only her, but also himself. "We'll make it, one step at a time." Ember slowly raised her head, meeting his gaze for the first time. It was a small but important moment. In her eyes, there was no longer just fear. There was a shadow of trust, fragile as the first sprout breaking through the stones. Ethan knew this was only the first step on a long journey, but he was ready to go the distance. The wind gently swept through Blackstone Valley, filling it with freshness after the recent storm. Ethan Rivers sat on a bale of hay, watching Ember, who now stood confidently on her feet, though her movements were cautious. The past few days had been tough. Caring for her wounds, the slow progress in restoring her health, and those rare moments when she rested had sharpened his sense of time. Each step forward felt like a victory, though Ethan knew there was still much to be done. He stood up, feeling a quiet pride swelling in his chest. Her coat, once dull and covered in mud, was beginning to regain its shine. But the biggest change was in her behavior. Ember no longer shied away from his touch, and her gaze was no longer filled with fear. "You have spirit, girl," he said, smiling, and ran his hand through her mane. "More than many people I know." That morning, the barn door swung open again. Nathan Hazlett appeared on the threshold. His face, as usual, was stern, but this time there was a hint of surprise in his eyes. He stopped, looking at the horse. "She's standing," he murmured, more to himself than to Ethan. "I didn't think she could." "She's not just standing. She's on her way to recovery," Ethan replied, not turning around. He continued to monitor the bandage on Ember's hind leg. Nathan took a few steps, his boots crunching loudly on the straw. "Are you still sure it's worth your efforts?" he asked, crossing his arms over his chest. His voice sounded less harsh than before, but still firmly filled with doubt. "This isn't about trends, Nathan," Ethan replied calmly. "It's about what's right. If I had left her there, she would have died. And now she's alive. Isn't that enough?" Nathan watched but didn't argue. Instead, he leaned against a wooden beam, observing how Ethan cared for the horse. After a while, he said, "You know what they say in the village, right? I think you're wasting your time. Let them think what they want," Ethan retorted, lifting his head. His voice was firm but not hostile. "This is my life, and I will decide what to spend it on." Later, when Nathan left, Ethan stepped out of the barn to get some fresh air. The sun was already high, illuminating the surroundings. At the edge of the field, he noticed a familiar figure. It was Owen Clark. He approached with his usual box in hand, and a slight smile played on his face. "Saw Nathan on my way here," Owen said, coming closer. "Looks like he's starting to think." "If he is, that's good," Ethan chuckled. "But I'm not here to convince people." Owen turned, setting the box on the ground. "I'm thinking about your Ember. Maybe she needs something more than just recovery. She needs a purpose. What do you think about starting training?" Ethan looked at him with disbelief. "Training? Do you think she's capable of that?" "You yourself said she has spirit," Owen replied. "Give her a chance to show it. And also," he added with a smile, "it might prove to the whole village that you were right." Ethan pondered. He wasn't seeking proof or praise, but the thought that Ember could achieve something more than just a peaceful life sparked something in him. Maybe this really was the path to freedom. "We'll try," he finally said, smiling. "One step at a time." Their conversation marked the beginning of new stages. Ahead lay work, trials, and perhaps a new chance for both of them. Blackstone Valley was bathed in autumn light when Ethan led Ember out of the barn. Her movements were cautious but confident, and watching her, he felt a sense of pride welling up inside him. How many times had he been told it was impossible, that she couldn't be saved, that his efforts were futile? But now, Looking at her strong, albeit still fragile body, he knew it was true. Owen Clark stood by the fence, holding a small whip in his hands, which he didn't use but just twirled between his fingers. His experience as a veterinarian and horse expert was invaluable, and today he had come to help Ethan start the training. "She looks good," Owen noted as Ethan brought Ember closer. "But remember, we're taking it slow. For her, this will be not just a physical test, but a psychological one as well." "I know," Ethan said, stroking Ember's neck. "She'll handle it. We'll handle it." The first training sessions were simple, walking in circles, gentle turns, stops, and commands. Ember obeyed, but her movements were still restrained, as if she was afraid to make a mistake again. Owen watched them attentively, occasionally giving advice. "Loosen the reins," he said at one point. "Let her feel freedom. She needs to understand that you're not an enemy." Ethan did as Owen said, and almost immediately felt the difference. Ember relaxed her neck, and her stride became smoother. It was a small but important step towards trust. "That's it, girl," Ethan said softly, smiling. "We'll handle it." When the training session ended, Ethan released Ember into a small enclosure. She stood for a few seconds, as if not knowing what to do, and then slowly moved forward. Her hooves softly touched the ground, and then, unexpectedly for Ethan, she began to trot, slowly at first, then faster. There was a joy in her movements that had long been suppressed. "See," Owen noted, leaning on the fence, "she still has fire. It just needs time to ignite." Ethan watched Ember, his heart filled with a warm feeling. She reminded him not only of his own journey, but also of what he himself had once lost. Perhaps they both helped each other find themselves. News that Ethan had started training the horse quickly spread through the village. Some still looked at it with disbelief, but there were also those who became interested. One day, a boy named Lucas appeared at the fence. He was 10 years old, with tousled red hair and a curious gaze. "Mr. Rivers," he began, shifting from foot to foot, "can I watch you work with the horse?" Ethan, surprised, paused for a moment, but then smiled. "Of course," he said, "but you have to promise not to scare her." "I promise," Lucas replied seriously, his eyes wide. Since then, the boy had become a frequent visitor. He watched every training session intently, sometimes helping Ethan with chores. His energy and genuine interest inspired, and Ethan realized that perhaps their story was beginning to touch more lives than just theirs and Ember's. Several weeks passed. Ember grew stronger, her steps became confident, and her movements smooth. Now she could perform more complex commands, and her eyes no longer reflected fear. She was a different horse, strong, determined, but still thoughtful. Ethan knew she was ready for more. "We'll try galloping," he said to Owen one morning. "Not rushing, but I think she can do it." "Good," Owen replied, nodding. "But remember, it's her rhythm. Don't push her." When Ethan first climbed into the saddle, he felt Ember tense. She twitched slightly, her ears flickering, but Ethan spoke softly, stroking her neck. "It's okay, girl. We're together." Slowly, step by step, they began to move. At first, it was just a walk, then a gentle trot. Ethan felt Ember trusting him more and more, her steps becoming confident, and her movements smoother. It was their shared triumph, a small but important victory. When the training session ended, Ethan dismounted and hugged Ember's neck. "You're the best, girl," he said softly. "We'll handle it." She nuzzled his shoulder with her muzzle, and he smiled. At that moment, he realized the path to freedom had already begun. The day dawned with a morning mist that softly enveloped Blackstone Valley. The sun barely pierced through the milky white veil, creating an atmosphere of anticipation. Today was a special day, the day of the village races. Ethan Rivers stood by the stall, checking Ember's gear. She stood beside him, her strong body calm, but her eyes held determination. "We're ready, girl," Ethan said, securing the saddle. His voice was quiet but firm. "Not to win, but to show everyone what you're capable of." Ember snorted softly, as if responding to his words. He smiled and patted her neck. Over the past months, she had changed. She had become stronger, more confident. But most importantly, there was no longer fear in her eyes. There was life. When they arrived at the village square, the atmosphere was buzzing. People crowded around the makeshift racetrack, laughing, discussing the expensive participants. Most eyes were on the shiny, well-groomed horses led by other participants. Ethan walked calmly beside Ember, not paying attention to the skeptical glances. "Is that the same horse?" someone in the crowd asked. "The one he saved? Does he really think she can do it?" Ethan let those words pass. He no longer felt anger or doubt. His goal was clear. Owen Clark, standing by the fence, surrounded him, giving an encouraging look. "Hang in there, Ethan," he said. "You're both ready." Ethan climbed into the saddle, feeling Ember's body tense beneath him. He leaned down to her ear to reassure her. "It's okay. Just do what you can." The signal to start the race sounded sharply, and the horses took off. The crowd roared, shouting the names of the favorites. Ethan and Ember started slowly, their pace measured. He knew that haste could be lost. One by one, the other participants overtook them, but Ethan remained calm. He felt Ember gaining speed, her movements becoming more confident. The crowd began to notice that they were gradually catching up with the others. "Look," someone shouted. "She's moving forward." By the middle of the race, Ember and Ethan were already among the leaders. Her strong legs carried her effortlessly along the track, and with each step, she drew closer to the finish line. The crowd, which had initially scoffed, now watched in awe at her grace and strength. But then the unexpected happened. One of the horses in front stumbled, and its rider crashed to the ground. The young man cried out in pain, and his horse struggled helplessly to get up. The crowd gasped. Ethan pulled on the reins, abruptly stopping Ember. He jumped off the saddle and rushed to the fallen rider. "Are you okay?" he asked, helping the guy stand. Yes, but my horse." The guy muttered, looking worriedly at his animal. Ethan quickly examined the horse. There were no fractures, but it was scared. "It's going to be okay," he said. "You can walk. Get on my horse." "But," the guy began, astonished. "You're losing the race." "Winning isn't the most important thing," Ethan replied. "Come on, don't waste time." The guy struggled onto Ember, and together they crossed the finish line to the loud roar of the crowd. The people who had doubted Ethan and his horse now stood up, applauding. After the race, Owen approached Ethan. His eyes shone with pride. "You did what you had to do," he said. "That's more important than any prize." Ethan's gaze was fixed on Ember, who now stood calmly, her breathing even. "She didn't just survive, Owen," he said. "She changed everything. For me, for this village, for herself." That evening, as the village began to celebrate, Ethan sat by the stall, watching Ember. Her eyes were calm, and there was no trace of the fear with which they had met on the first night. "You did it, girl," he said softly, stroking her neck. "You proved you can do anything." The horse gently nuzzled his shoulder, and Ethan smiled. This was not just a victory. It was a new beginning for both of them, full of hope and light that illuminated even the darkest corners of their past lives.